Thank you, Koki and Valerie. Wonderful, wonderful presentations. As I mentioned before, Koki has to unfortunately go on to her next event. And so she is going to spend a few minutes in the back right now signing books. If you'd like to get a book signed by Koki, now is the time to do this. Valerie will be around with our other panel members later, so you don't have to rush back unless you're looking for Koki right now. So next up, we are going to go straight ahead into our panel discussion. And our moderator today is Kimberly Robinson, who is a professor of law at the University of Richmond, where she teaches and writes in the area of education, law, and policy, and is a national expert on the federal role in education and equal educational opportunity. She's a senior fellow at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law School, and is co-editing a book with Harvard professor Charles Ogletree entitled Rodriguez at 40, Creating New Pathways to Equal Educational Opportunity. Prior to joining the Richmond Law faculty, Robinson was an associate professor at Emory University School of Law and a visiting fellow at the George Washington University Law School. She also served as the General Counsel's office, served in the General Counsel's office of the U.S. Department of Education, where she helped draft federal policy on issues of race, sex, and disability discrimination, and represented school districts in school finance and constitutional law litigation as an associate with Hogan and Hartson, LLP. She earned a BA from the University of Virginia and a JD from Harvard Law School. So please join me in welcoming Kimberly Robinson, our moderator for this afternoon.
So I would love to have, I'd love to have our panelists join us now on stage, so I could introduce each of you while you're sitting here. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'll introduce Dr. Statsky when she's able to join us here. To my right, we have Joan Hedrick. She's the Charles A. Dana Professor of History at Trinity College and author of Harriet Beecher Stowe, A Life, which is a 1995 Pulitzer Prize winner. Next to her, we have Jocelyn Chadwick. She is a lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and author of The Jim Dilemma, Reading Race and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And then on the far end is Catherine Clinton. She's a professor of US history at Queen's University Belfast. So she gets the award for the farthest travel today. And author of Harriet Tubman, The Road to Freedom. And last but not least, we have Sandra Statsky, who is Professor Emerita at University of Arkansas. So the format we're going to follow today is that each of our panelists are going to be able to make brief remarks of 3 to 5 minutes, and then I will ask them some questions that are open for any of the panelists to answer, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So we'll start with Professor Statsky.
Start with me.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to make remarks about two different subjects, one related to the women that we just heard about this earlier. I happen to be in the field of education, and one of the questions that I would like to have an answer to at some point, and maybe we could have it only in relation to Zora Neale Hurston, is what did they themselves read as part of their own self-education that made them the kinds of people they were? We now ask questions like that of a lot of people, And I've been looking at, for example, the lives of great composers to find out what their inspirations were, Beethoven in particular. But I think it's interesting to students today to find out what these, particularly a creative writer, what that person read that inspired them, that influenced them in some way. I certainly don't know what Zora did, but I think it would be interesting to find out. And what the very active political ladies, the first ladies in the late 18th, early 19th century, what did they read? Because they were all literate so far as I know. So what were the kinds of books or other things beside religious scriptures that they read that inspired them, that helped to form their character? I think those would be useful kinds of things that young students today ought to think about. The other is the influence that first ladies actually had all through history, and I'm sure a lot of you, perhaps all of you, are aware of the series that has been on C-SPAN of presidents' wives throughout history up through the present day, and they have been extremely informative, and I think there are lots of wonderful areas to mine in terms of what these women all throughout history did, living as they did in the shadow of their husbands who were presidents, but to find out much more about them. And the series that I have seen, the particular ones, are just an opening into what we just don't know about the influence today of these women in various ways because of their husband's position, but the access that they had at different times historically to do many interesting things that they had an opportunity to do. And it's taking advantage of what's there, and I think it would be interesting for young people to know what spontaneously you can think about when you really don't know what's going to be around. I think that's all I'll say at this point.
Well, I just want to say a word about how we think about the past and how we think about who the great people in the past are. Historians of women and of the arts have challenged the question, why are there no great women artists? And they've said, well, you know, that's really not the right question. That question carries already an assumption. The real issue is, by what standards do we declare someone great? And I think both of our keynoters have talked about women who either weren't fully recognized for periods of history or were behind the scenes in some way, but had enormous influence, enormous creativity. And I started my biography of Harriet Beecher Stowe with the question, how could she have been so central to the literary history of her time and so marginal to that of the 20th century? And what I discovered was that a lot of it had to do with the access that women had in the 19th century to writing and to the pen, which completely surprised me because I had the modernist notion of what literature was, that, you know, you had to basically commit your life to art and you couldn't have much outside of that. And in fact, writing in the 19th century was very much a part of women's social role, writing letters, entertaining in the parlor. They didn't have television, radio, all of those amusements. So what did they do after dinner? They read aloud poems and stories that the women and the men had written. And women had just as free access to that as the men did. So I thought about parlor literature as the founding of the great American Renaissance that happened in the 1850s, and discovered that really women were on the ground floor of American literature. They were writing the bestsellers of the time, Susan Warner's Wide, Wide World, The Lamplighter by Maria Cummins, and of course Uncle Tom's Cabin. They established American literature, but when it became a profession, you know what happened. I can hear you. You had high culture journals like The Atlantic and The Nation, magazines that we still have today. But their editorial boards were all men. Their reviewers were all men. The reviewers started writing vicious reviews of the women writers and pushing them aside and making room for the men. The Nation was so completely male that one woman quipped they should call it the Stagnation. So when the canon of American literature was established in the 20th century, Emily Dickinson was the only woman who made it into it because she was kind of modernist in her difficulty. But women like Stowe and Lydia Maria Child, who were writing about some of the great pressing issues of the day, were considered sentimental. They were just trying to move people to action. They were doing things that weren't so important as creating great, beautiful objects of art that you put on the mantle. So in short, the standards had changed, and the women were ejected from the canon. They've been, of course, recovered by the work of scholars like Valerie, like many other feminist writers of the 70s and 80s, and they have moved back. But this issue of standards, I think, is very important to keep in mind because they can be used to exclude as well as to maintain the health and the well-being of a country, as we could see in many examples today, which I won't go into. Thank you.
I'm an English teacher amidst historians, and I deal in dead people for the most part, the 19th century. And I deal in radical women of the 19th century. Twain was married to one. And I like the 19th century for a lot of reasons. And one is that on both sides of the Atlantic, the women are phenomenal. And I'm in quite a few classrooms around the country talking to high school students because little kids scare me to death. When you said you really liked the little ones, I was sitting there thinking, really? They frighten me, and so I like those high school kids. I've taught them, and I am constantly in their classrooms, and what I find hopeful about them is that they are curious about these radical women and the primary sources, and they want to know about them. So for me, being a Twain scholar and an English teacher, it's difficult to teach my period or my guy without history and without the women. So when folks talk about the disconnect, that whole conversation is a disconnect for me because it's a coherent, cohesive whole. And the students have amazing questions that even my graduate students don't have. Particularly, some will ask me, well, what's up with Twain and Huck Finn? There are no women. Well, there are women. You may not like the ones he has, but there are other books by Twain where he has very strong women. And the women in Huck are strong. They're just despicable. But his essays, and so the whole idea of Women's History Month, I absolutely love, but I would like for it to be more than a month. I would like for African American History Month to be more than a month. I would like for everyone to be put back where they belong, so that when there are important women during the 17th century, wherever they are, they come about. Women, as Joan said, women were writing and very prolific in the 18th, late 18th, 19th century. And to add to your story, Anna Julia Cooper, who is an African-American essayist who writes Voices from the South, wrote Du Bois once and said, you're getting ready to write your anthology, but from what I understand, there are no women. And Du Bois's response was, none of them are worthy to be in the anthology. So, of course, shock. To quote our president, shock and awe. I was totally shocked and awed and thought, you have got to be kidding me. So I'm glad that we're here. Hopefully there will be lively conversation. Thank you.
So it very much pleases me to be back in a place where so much of my education began. And I'm sorry I'm reading, but I'm a bit jet lagged. Here in a hotel which once welcomed Charles Dickens, and indeed Mary Lincoln stayed here when she was visiting her son across the river. Wandering the streets of Boston yesterday took me a little bit down memory lane. I'm teaching in the north of Ireland at the great Queen's University, but here I found I'm surrounded by a kind of history and exceptionalism, and it really jarred me. And of course, Cokie scooped me talking about Phyllis Wheatley, because when a young African girl was purchased by a man off the dock in Boston Harbor, he named her Phyllis after the ship she was brought across on. She learned Greek, Latin, even writing in iambic pentameter. Yes, she was published in England, but here in Boston, the printer didn't believe that these were the actual poems. So she was examined by 18 gentlemen of her day. And Phyllis's big test is how I capture the story in a recent children's book, building from the story of my former colleague in the department at Harvard, Henry Louis Gates, who delivered his Jefferson lecture in 2002 on Phyllis. In my book, I was trying to imagine what Phyllis must have felt like on that walk. And because we're asking what some of the women read, when I began my journey working on Harriet Tubman, I couldn't think about what she read because she was illiterate her entire life. But the road to freedom was something that I, as a scholar and historian, wanted to limit myself to the moments she experienced, and she did recount. She was a talker. So I would contextualize in a biography from the fragments of her life that we now treasure. And it's indeed right here in this town that she came many times, and she, as a hero of the Underground Railroad, was welcomed into the radical community here in Boston. When she would speak, she would often take the pseudonym of Garrison. She was well known as the Moses of her people, but she spoke on a platform alongside Wendell Phillips, William Lloyd Garrison. She also spoke in 1860 to a women's suffrage convention and many other audiences here. She was supported by Governor Andrew of Massachusetts during the Civil War when she was sent down south behind enemy lines in order to help the Massachusetts 54th and other troops. She was a leader on the Combahee River Raid conducted in the late hours of June 1st, 1863. So during that one night and into the wee hours of the morning, she liberated 750 runaways, bringing them, assisted by 150 black soldiers, ferried to safety. Tales of her exploits actually appeared in the Boston Commonwealth, again, anonymously, not naming her. After the war, she was named, but it took her over 30 years to obtain a military pension, which she deserved, her heroism being embraced here in Boston when in 1904, a group of women decided to name a settlement house after her, and the Harriet Tubman House. She came herself in 1904 from the home that she had founded in upstate New York in Auburn, her hometown, adopted hometown. It was the only facility for African Americans outside of New York City. Now, I discovered in the files of the Schoenberg Library when working on my book that in oral history, Oswald Garrison Villard, the grandson of William Lloyd Garrison, was solicited for his opinions on this friend of his grandfather, on Tubman. He offered none, as this Harvard-educated scion of a great Boston family had no idea who she was. She'd fallen out of fashion. But it was an African-American commitment to education that kept her memory alive. And by 1972, when it was Villard's centenary, it was Tubman's name who was more recognized. But it's not really a battle or a contest or a rank order that we should be concerned with, but we need to think about those individuals who have made sacrifices and shaped and changed our society to make it what it is today. We need to look at the exceptionalism and the struggles for social justice. We need to think about those people who we do not celebrate. Tubman actually died, celebrated by many of her race, and after her death on March 10th, 1913, people within the African American community continued to eulogize her and have Phyllis Wheatley clubs. Tubman died the same month that a young Rosa Parks was born. So we have a continuum of significant actors, contributors, ideologues, icons who can be looked to celebrate their stories, stories that changed our own times, will influence those of our children and hopefully their children's children as well. We're here as educators and writers and biographers, and I know we need to continue to think about recovering lost lives through words. But if you're tired, keep going. If you're hungry, keep going. If you want to taste freedom, keep going. These were the words of Harriet Tubman. She was not a man of words, but a woman of action. So thank you very much.
So one of the themes that's been recurrent among the panelists and then also those who spoke earlier is this, how women are not often included in the narrative of history. Their story is often lost, and now many are trying to recover their story. And I'd love to hear from the panelists about what the major causes of that are today. We know sort of what they were historically, but what are the causes of why that continues to happen today as schools and universities think about what is important to teach students?
I think it's because it's so much work. I speak as someone who's been asked by the Oxford, Dictionary of American Biography to go through and look at it. I know Joan's been on these projects. We are asked to be revising, and we do have to actually, be inclusive, but we also, in some ways, have to be exclusive. We are redefining, the various stories we want to put in. So when I'm given a list of 100 diplomats of the 19th century and asked to assess their importance, where Madam C.J. Walker is not included, where Charlotte Fortin is not included, where a whole range of writers and contributors. And so I was thinking today about how, I think in my generation, in the 70s, we wanted to really blow up the canon. That was the idea. But I remember thinking about an older generation of women who said, they'll make you come in and clean it up. You blow it up, and you're going to have to be cleaning it up. So instead, I think there's been a real generation of people doing the work, finding the stories and putting them in, and not taking no for an answer. I mean, I worked on a K through 6 system, and we were doing biographies for very young readers, because I think the life story, and that was something that drew me out of strictly writing for a historical audience to writing for a more general audience. The life stories can really tell a lot. But it's work to get, Zora into the canon. It's work to get Wheatley. And you can find Wheatley, for example, as Koki pointed out, in grade schools across America, but only recently was, quote, an adult biography written that included her. And it's very difficult because people are included and mentioned, but how often is the context of their lives included in American history?
I'd like to respond to that too, because, in secondary, women are there. They're there, but they're there in the literary surveys. They're there in 11th grade. They're there in 12th grade. They're not necessarily, and you're right, haven't always been there, but they've been there in the 11th and 12th grade literary surveys. So you do have Mary Wollstonecraft, you do have Margaret Fuller, you do have Zora Neale Hurston, you do have Alice Walker, you have all those people, Sylvia Plath. I mean, they are there, but they have been reserved for secondary, upper secondary. And I can see your knitted brow as to why is that. I think that, well, one of the things, of course, let me just say, they've also been reserved for English language arts, not necessarily history. So, again, it's in my mind, we've always had them, but I wasn't necessarily aware that they weren't also in history, being talked about in history classes. But certainly in the English language arts courses and the literary surveys, they have always been there.
Could I ask actually a question at this point about one of my favorite writers? And she was always read years ago in almost every 9th or 10th grade class, and her novel became scorned. And I'm referring to the author of Silas Marner. But when I went to high school, everybody read something by George Eliot, and they knew that that was not her real name. And she's nowhere to be found anymore. And I don't understand, because I became turned on to all of the works of George Eliot as a result of poor Silas Marner, and then read all of them afterwards, Adam Bede and others, and do not understand why she isn't even on lists today, or why one of her works, she was acknowledged as one of the greatest 19th century novelists in her time, and certainly led a remarkably different life from what was expected of her at the time, but nevertheless was revered and honored as a great writer, and yet she's nowhere to be found by any of her works today in our high schools. I don't know why, because her psychological insights, her style, everything was amazing. So I think there is a peculiarity in thinking about inclusion today and exclusion yesterday. It wasn't exclusion for some of these people yesterday, but today it is. And let me go back to history just very quickly and say, I look at a lot of U.S. history books, and one of the powerful female leaders of our time is someone who's almost nowhere to be found, and I'm referring to Margaret Thatcher. Now, there's a different issue that we have to deal with, because here was somebody who was an extremely influential political figure in the late 20th century. I don't know why she should be disappeared on the grounds.
Well, I live in Northern Ireland, so I have a good idea about why.
But we're talking
Maggie
about
Thatcher
U.S.
does it.
history
But
here.
I'd like to go back to the question, about inclusion, exclusion, and I do take your point about that. I mean, I know when the Schlesinger Library was collecting Phyllis Schlafly's papers, people were raising eyebrows. But I certainly look and say that we need to be, inclusive, and we need to look at those strong figures and women who have emerged as voices, whether we agree with their voices or not. We have to not find the same way in which the powers that be, the authorities, have kept in or excluded people. And again, I'm not one to take exception to George Eliot, who my first book, The Plantation Mistress, uses an epigraph from Middlemarch. So I'm a big fan. But again, I'm talking about the fact that, Zora Neale Hurston, as you so poetically put it, died in an unmarked grave and was, disappeared. And when she was resurrected and included in the canon often will expand and shrink. And when it shrinks, I take your point that there are slots designated. And maybe you could speak to that, Joan, the way in which you see the slots, because you mentioned Harriet Beecher Stowe, one of the most popular writers of her day, which also she may come in as a powerful historic voice, but in literature, in some ways, has been damned as one of the scribbling women. So.
Yeah, I remember teaching an American literature survey in which I included 4 women writers out of 13 books, and I got
A riot.
Yeah. We're reading trash. Why are we reading all these women writers? Now, admittedly, this was back in the 70s, but I do think that once you get over a certain quota, and I'm thinking maybe it's about a third, it's too much. It's just too much. Deborah Tannen has written a wonderful book called You Just Don't Understand, in which she went around with a tape recording couples, mixed-sex couples in conversation, and then asked them afterwards, did you feel you got your fair share of the conversation? And if a woman had gotten 1/3 of the conversational time, she said yes. And there was only, I think, one instance, in any instance where a woman went over that, the men felt that they had not gotten their fair share. So I do think that we these are standards that are internalized in some way that do keep equal representation from happening. And when we look at our political scene, we are so far in this great democracy from having political representation that's anywhere near 52% that I think we get used to a much lower standard.
Actually, I want to go back to something that Dr. Healy mentioned when she started us off today, which is that in 2009, the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Secondary Education decided not to implement passage of a U.S. history test as a high school graduation requirement. In 2011, Congress and the White House defunded the National We the People civic education program, and this past summer, NAEP, the National Assessment for Educational Progress, indefinitely canceled the U.S. History and Civics test. So this raises the question of, is American students' knowledge of U.S. history adequate, and where does U.S. history, and particularly women's role in that history, stand in the hierarchy of American education? Is part of the challenge that we've gotten away from teaching history in our schools. And so, of course, once you cut back on history, the first thing that's going to get cut is women in history. But it seems like that might be part of the challenge that we're facing right now. So I'd love the panelists to comment on that.
I would want to say that the reduction or elimination of U.S. history is often accompanied by the elimination of constitutional and political history, which is where you find important figures left out that we should read about, not because of what they are, male or female, because of their ideas. And this is what a number of us are concerned about, that the political ideas are not there, regardless of the author. And we no longer have today, as I think about it, the kind of political ferment about the nature of government as existed even 100 years ago. I live in a town that was the first to have, quotes, representative town meeting. It took 20 years for a lawyer, whose name was Alfred Chandler, to get enabling legislation to have a different form of town meeting so that a government by people who lived in the town, not a city form of government, could exist. Well, the kind of conversation that took place then simply doesn't take place anymore, because we don't talk about very much the nature of these different aspects of political philosophy, and that's what's now almost disappeared from our history. So I'm thinking that we've got to think about the ideas that we're losing by not focusing on U.S. history as opposed to specific people.
Well, I think to answer your question and the questions, the panel questions that we were given, apparently the National Council for Social Studies agrees with you, because they've spent the last 2 years trying to figure out their own, dare I say the word, core, to try and think about the fact that history has not kept up, that it's been parceled out. I know that when I started teaching, history teachers were coaches, and no one took them seriously. I mean, true, they were coaches, and it was a joke. And so now what it seems to me, and I don't know how successful, it's called the College Career and Civic Life C3 Framework for Social Studies Standards, how successful it's going to be. But their goal, if you read their introduction, their goal is to reclaim history, American world, geography. They have amazing partners to have brought all of these standards together to try and corral what Sandra and others are talking about, and that is to go back to acknowledging the import of history in K-12. And so if you haven't seen that, it's online, it's free, it's, you just read it and see if you like it, don't like it, write them, tell them. They did send the standards out for people to comment on, and teachers. I think that while we sit here and we talk about this and who's included and who's not included, teachers drive quite a bit of what we have in our classrooms. University professors, we come in, we go out, we write the books, but it's teachers who actually put the rubber to the road with our students. And they want the content, they need the content, so they're not adverse to teaching the history, but they do need some sort of guidance. And I think that perhaps this is what the social studies folks are trying to do in terms of not just American history, but world history, geography, environment, and put the import back, take the, not dissing any athletic person, but putting a content person in a real content course.
And Yes.
Could I just add to that?
Also,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
And maybe also, though, that history has become a very contested battleground. And just to give one little example, when I look at the centenary of the American Civil War 50 years ago and the sesquicentennial we're undergoing now, I mean, questions and battles continue to be fought. So there is a political stripe to this as well. But I think the great idea is that America is looked as a country that emancipated slaves during the American Civil War. They were self-emancipated, but also the leadership of Lincoln in that has undergone dramatic change. And it's not just in our textbooks, it's in films, it's in popular culture, it goes on around. I see documentary filmmakers out there. What our children are absorbing through media and the culture is just as important, and we need to think about that as educators. And so we can't sit in the ivory tower. When I first began to work on social studies series, my colleagues were explaining to me that wasn't real research, that wasn't part of the research culture of the institution I was in. I left that institution, and I then, continued to be an educator and to see also writing for children, again, something that we needed to be doing. And don't be scared, we can get you back into those questions, because I think from young people, they are asking us the important questions to connect the past to the present. Now, that was sneered at a lot as relativity in the 1970s, but it's nothing. You must connect to your material. The great ideas are still there. And teaching U.S. history abroad, I can say, the ideas are very much what fire people up, and the abstract concepts are what people are looking for. But they are looking for it through the template of a story. And storytelling comes in many, many different forms. And my colleagues who don't believe in the power of storytelling and want to restrict themselves to the academic monographs, I can no longer believe that they're going to have the positive and energizing effect that we need in a 21st century classroom, when our students can see wars around the world, challenges around the world, changes in the White House that need to really come into their classrooms in a dramatic way.
I would like to add to the mention of these new guidelines that one of the serious deficiencies with some of what is now coming through is that they are devoid of recommended readings about these ideas. That is the problem with this fear of treading on somebody's toes, but there is not one recommended reading in this new set of guidelines, whereas if you go back to the old history and social studies document that Massachusetts had, it had several pages of recommended readings that were important. Some of them were stories and some of them were not. The Federalist Papers, for example, are not stories, but they should be read by all students before they graduate from high school. The Declaration of Independence, other founding documents which no longer are read because their 18th century language may not be accessible, which is another issue that has to be raised. How do we help children to read the important ideas of political philosophy, moral philosophy, when they were written in an older language and in a complex syntax with a multi-syllabic vocabulary that students today, I'm sorry to say, have difficulty accessing? So this becomes part of our challenge and is one of the reasons why history has been oversimplified, and we need to figure out how to recapture a more complex history that would get in more.
Wonderful. So let's switch gears and focus a little bit on literature for a moment and consider, so for generations, the works of Jane Austen, you were mentioning George Eliot, Mary Shelley in British literature, and Edith Wharton, Harriet Beecher Stowe in American literature have all been standard high school texts. However, under the new National Common Core standards in English language arts, there's far greater emphasis on informational texts rather than classic literature in high school. What will this mean for classic British and American literature in K-12 education and in higher education?
Well, being the English person here, I like this question because, again, we still teach in English language arts. We teach Elizabeth Cady Stanton's The Bible. We teach Virginia Woolf's Did Shakespeare Have a Sister? We teach Alice Walker's wonderful essay about Zora Neale Hurston in Search of Our Mother's Gardens. The whole concept of informational text, as Sandra was talking about, the Federalist Papers are taught in the 11th grade American Literature Survey. Because you can't teach an American Literary History Survey and not deal with informational texts. As Emerson said, America started out without a literature. We started out with journals and letters and biographies and charts and graphs and no authors. And so if you don't read Emerson's American Scholar, where he says we've been Shakespeareized enough and we need our own American scholar, you really don't know that we didn't have a literature. And so the Brontes are still taught in British literature. What I like about Zora Neale Hurston is that her short stories now are being taught, which are fabulous, and not just at the 10th or 11th grade, but at the 10th grade and at the 9th grade, and students like them. A couple of weeks ago, I was in a high school classroom and took part of Frederick Douglass's Monthly. My husband and I scanned the actual document and took it to a couple of classes with some students, and they were fascinated by that document and the language and had questions about it. So again, it's about how do we as educators take what we know needs to be in the classroom to the classroom, to work with teachers and their professional learning communities to help them understand, to give them the tools that we know so well to help our students.
And so I've worked, for example, with teachers in the New York City public schools that are trying to get education into the K through 2 classroom, and we worked on the subject of holidays because you work through history. And I see one of my students here from Queen's University, big plug, who worked on what African Americans thought of the 4th of July before the American Civil War, recovering documents. He could do that online because we are living in a new world where students can punch into Google, and besides coming up with, unfiltered porn sites, they are able to come up with issues. I bring this up because in my series at Oxford, I wanted to do a new reader on Latina legacies. And so I went in to see what might compete. And my 2 sons very quickly told me to get off the internet, to stop using this phrase, because I had no idea about where it would lead me. So we need, as educators, to educate ourselves in many different dimensions. But it is the text. We are recovering the text, and we are putting these things online. But as, I'm really struck by the idea of informational versus stories, because in my work, I try not to privilege, for example, the written over oral testimony, because I think, working in African American history for 30, 40 years, you learn very quickly these issues. And Koki pointed out when she was talking about Valerie Jarrett's, what is written down, what is told, what is passed on. But nevertheless, I think, we really have an opportunity. When computers came into the classroom, remember, they were teaching computer. So what is teaching computer? Is it keyboarding? So if you get the content in, you get, to in a way, influence. And so we as educators have to think about coming out of the ivy-covered walls, and we also have to get in the trenches, and we have to think about it. You're right, teachers are the ones doing it, and when I look at the standards that are put on them, it is quite daunting. But we need to make accessible the new histories of those people, from the people that have been lost, forgotten, erased in many ways, recovered, bashed about on the floor of Congress. My own Harriet Tubman became a real punching bag during the history standards. And I think we have to think about ways that we can really try and come together and say the great ideas of the 18th century maybe are still with us. Some new ideas are there, new technologies that let us get into every classroom. At the same time, I want to say, I always talk about the computer in this very open way, but I was recently reminded at a Harvard forum about how many classrooms do not give accessibility, and the fact that maybe we should think about in the 21st century delivery of material to all children so they can compete equally once they get out of school. Sorry, enough preaching from the Northern Irish.
Just thinking about the difference between the informational and the narrative and the storytelling and the literary, if we do drop out the latter, it seems to me what we are not fostering is imagination in our students. And I think of imagination as being such an important quality to develop, because it enables us to think about different solutions, different worlds, different ways of doing things. I mean, the creativity that is let loose by that is really important. And also, when we read stories, we're not told what to think about them, but we develop our own moral values and our ethics by imagining what we would do in that situation. That's extremely important. We also develop empathy by reading stories about people. Another really important quality, it seems to me, that we need to develop in our citizens if we are to really be a healthy and a whole republic, where we are thinking about more than ourselves, and we're thinking about, well, what is the good life, and what should the world look like, and can we imagine a better way of doing things? These are so important to citizenship, and I think that literary materials really develop that.
I would like to second what you just said, and this is one of the great fears today, is that the particular set of standards called Common Core in the English language arts attempt to reduce literary study to about half of the reading curriculum in the English class and try to increase what is called informational text, but it's informational text of recent writings, so that the focus is on what is practical, utilitarian, and this is one of the great concerns of many of the parents who are becoming rather upset about the kinds of readings that their children are being given in the high schools as opposed to what they had before. And we haven't yet figured out how to deal with this reduction of complex literary study, increase in something called informational, when it is controlled across a number of states by groups of states as opposed to individual states. And that is one of the aspects of local and state control in education people are afraid we are losing. I will stop here because that opens up another whole conversation that was not part of this particular one today.
Sure. Some of the comments Dr. Clinton and Chadwick were making focused on the teaching profession and how teachers are ensuring that different authors and texts are taught. And women have dominated the teaching profession for over a century. What are the ways in which women are asserting their academic leadership in K-12 education and increasingly in higher education?
Well, I've seen in history, at least, a big move towards women trying to continue their education, and continuing education is an important part. In speaking, the federal government funds NEH summer workshops in history. The Gilder Lehrman Institute, a co-sponsor here, is really, I think, very pioneering, like the Pioneer Institute, in bringing the importance of having teachers continue to be given the opportunity to do new readings, but using primary source documents is the major emphasis of the Gilder Lehrman Institutes, bringing scholars to teachers. I got to participate in the first of their elementary school teachers participating rather than the high schools. And I think that the profession is, the professionalization of the teaching profession, and I can't speak to recertification and other issues, but I know opening up opportunities, because people go in at one level, they need all those tools and education, and then they're thrown into a classroom with constant change and not given the support. But certainly principals are actively trying to encourage this, and so I believe there's been a serious effort to see the teaching profession for what it is, nobility on the front lines of our future. So.
I'd like to add to that because in January and in February, I've spent more time on the Hill than I have at home talking about educational policies. And what I really enjoyed was that I was with mostly women. Senator Warren, here from Massachusetts, her educational counsel, her administrative assistant are both women. Markey has assistants who are women. The representatives we had with whom we spoke from the Department of Education were former teachers who were liaisons on the Hill and were voices. So again, it's moving out in terms of still being teachers and teachers becoming part of their own professional learning communities and having a voice, but also teachers figuring out that they also can exert that same voice and bring their expertise to bear politically. And still keep it within the educational context.
And within higher education, I see a lot of mentoring relationships between senior women and junior women, which I think is a very important structure for bringing women into leadership. I think men have known how to network and make connections, and women now are doing that, and I think that makes a difference in retaining good professors, giving them advice in terms of how to manage their careers. I know it was invaluable to me. I didn't have a mentor for the first 10 years probably of my career, and it went a lot better once I did. I didn't have the concept, so that's I think just a small way that could be very important.
The question that I thought you may have raised was about the role of so many women now being teachers, females, and I would like to raise what I think is a sociological issue that is becoming clearer at the high school level. We have mainly women teaching at the elementary school, which we've always had, and now they are in greater number at the secondary school. This leaves about half of our population with very few models of education, young boys, young adolescent boys. And I speak now from self-interest. I'm the grandmother of grandsons, and I'm concerned as much about them and their education as I am about my granddaughters. And we know that the balance at the college level is now about 60% female and 40% male. There is a serious imbalance in who is going on to higher education. I'm not saying it's because most of their teachers are female, and I'm not trying to say we shouldn't have female teachers at the high school level, but we have to think about role models for young boys. They are not there, and they're not going on to college. Where they're disappearing to, we don't quite know, frankly. But it is a serious concern, and there are many colleges now that are hiding the numbers because girls want to go to colleges where there are enough males to have a social life. I mean, this is just natural. This is part of their life experience. So we have a growing issue that we must think about. How do we encourage and have more male role models as teachers in our secondary schools? I don't know that it's going to ever be easy to get them at the elementary school level, but...
Well, we need to contextualize that the education of women is such an important concern. And I'm in a culture, for example, where women often return to school. And that's very important because in Europe, as well as in the United States, the inequity of pay is quite an ongoing concern. And if we look at who is raising the children and contributing to their support, this is an ongoing broad issue. And so women need that education. It's almost more valuable to them because if you look at the high school dropout, what he earns versus the high school woman graduate, the college woman graduate. I mean, when I was an undergraduate, it was 57 cents on the dollar. Now it's raised to 81 cents on the dollar. And I'm very grateful for that increase. At the same time, I see a growing disparity in terms of women being forced into jobs that aren't at their ability and level, and this is something government will address. It's a larger question. On the role model, so important to have mentors, and I would like to say I do think there is an increasing flexibility there. We need to see people, but at the same time, I can speak as someone who, as an undergraduate, my role model was neither my gender nor my race, and I found that a refreshing thing to think about, that diversity in education and diversity in role models, so that you don't always see a teacher as one particular person, and you see a variety of opportunities in the field of education, that the male won't always be the principal and the female won't always be the teacher, but this kind of new world that we live in, I hope will continue to diversify.
So research is very robust that shows that one of the biggest determinants of child's achievement in education is really the education of the mother. And I thought the phrase that Dr. Clinton used about teachers being nobility on the front lines, I think also mothers could be called nobility on the front lines, and the responsibilities that they have in educating and raising children. This is not to denigrate the role of fathers, but the research is very robust that it's women's education that actually influences greatest the future educational achievement of a child. So that raises the question, what can be done to help all mothers of all socioeconomic backgrounds help to improve student achievement for American students?
Well, I think, going back to what Catherine said, this whole idea, one of the reasons that women are excelling, so many women are excelling now, is that we have our voice. We don't mind asserting our voice. We don't have to live under the pseudonym of a guy, like the Bronte sisters, or put on male's clothing to assert that we are feminists or strong, or refer to ourselves as bitches. We are independent, and we believe in ourselves, and we're strong. I think we have to do what Frederick Douglass talked about, reach back and make sure that we communicate not just to our friends and to those with whom we feel comfortable, but go into places where they don't expect to see you, and let their children see us, integrate and converse with them, so that the children take the message home. Guess who I saw today? I saw this woman walking in my class, and she actually took time and talked to us, elementary, middle, secondary. I think that we have to volunteer. I read that question. That is such a huge question about, the gap, the economic gap, the educational gap. We can't solve all that, but we can begin to address it in some small way with using our own talents.
In the college classroom, I always give special privilege to mothers who are returning, and I get in trouble because we have very, very strict rules about favoritism in Northern Ireland. But if a student wants to switch tutorials and they're a mother, I say, go ahead. But I'm joking about it, but I'm also saying I reach out to mature students. I reach out to those people who haven't found their voice. And voice is so important in literature. I know with Joan's biography, she tells us about the voice of these women, and we're all working on voices and stories. And I think the American mother is used so often as a symbol, as a weapon, and has been from the days of the American Revolution forward. But again, I think, off the pedestal and into the trenches is where mothers and educators need to take their maternal instincts. So.
Just following up on Catherine's comments, I think that kind of flexibility in educational opportunity is so important to women. When I was thinking about the issue of standards, I remembered the Flexner Report of 1910, which shut down all the night medical schools, which basically eliminated women from the medical profession. And women had been moving in, making good strides up until that point. It also eliminated the working class people of both sexes who couldn't afford to leave their job and go to medical school. So how opportunity is structured is just so important. And one thing I'm very proud of at my school, Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, is that we have something called an individualized degree program for older students returning to college to finish their undergraduate degree. And in most colleges, you have to go as a full-time student, take 4 or 5 courses, which of course most adults can't do because they're working or they have family responsibilities. But in this program, one can take as little as 1 course a semester, and you can take as long as you need to, as many years as it takes to get your degree. And I have seen women in their 70s getting their degree and being very happy about it. So flexibility in educational opportunity.
Okay, so I'm going to close with this question, and then we're going to open it up for question and answer. So please think about what you'd like to ask our distinguished panel. So Ginger Rogers did everything that Fred Astaire did, but she did it backwards and in high heels. Please comment about how this quote might relate to noted women in U.S. history and literature. Just provocative at the end.
You know, notice no one is jumping up.
How does dancing backwards?
Well, fighting for freedom, I do have to come back to Harriet Tubman. I've worked on a large number of women, Susie King Taylor, Mary Chestnut. I was so struck by Mary Chestnut's diary as the #1 selling diary consulted on the Civil War. She earned $10 during her lifetime for her writing. So we're covering all these people. But I do think that, you know, we have to emphasize in context, because I find today when I deal with some students and I'm talking about a woman, I'm so happy that they're in a post there was a feminist movement, there still is, but they are the sons of feminists, let's call that, you know, and not my own, but I'm encountering them. And when I talk about a woman being in this position, they don't see it as remarkable. So it's incumbent upon me to contextualize as an historian, to always give the context of the handicaps. And the little student who said, where do you eat? I mean, I know, Valerie, you know some of those archives. You know, you'd go in and say, I'm here to look at women. They said, we don't have anything. You know, and then you ate alone, and you dug, and you dug. But the issue is that we are changing it to where now, you know, the remarkability factor, let's hope it can disappear in our children's generation. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to keep talking about the high heels, which, you know, I think is the American form of bound feet. You know, but I speak wearing flats. There you go.
Another flat wearer. I'd like to follow up on the high heel thing, because when I read that, I thought about, we have spent quite a bit of time talking about all the famous women whose names we know, and some names you may have heard for the first time, but there are so many unsung great women who did so many wonderful things for this country. My personal hero is Viola Liuzzo, who just sort of fell off, talk about falling off the map. She just fell totally off the map. And students love hearing about the everyday heroes, this mother, daughter, wife, who just decided that she was going to go and help with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and never came home again. She was killed. She was murdered. And her children carried on that memory. And I love talking about all of the famous people. Remember, I deal in dead folks, so they love being talked about. But I really, I would say more. I would really like to think that we could resurrect some of the everyday heroes to help our students understand that being a hero doesn't mean you have to be Martha Washington, or you have to be Zora Neale Hurston, or Toni Morrison, or Harriet Beecher Stowe, or Harriet Tubman. You can be Viola Liuzzo, who just thought, I want to do the right thing, and I want to do what I think is right for myself and for my family, and she did it. And I think that that's something that's really important for all of us as educators to do, to resurrect these really silent voices and bring them to bear for the relevance. You know, you want to make it relevant. Talk about someone who cooked meals every day, went to PTA meetings, went to church, synagogue, whatever, or didn't, and, you know, just normal things, and then decided, I'm gonna make a difference. That's all.
I do have a student working on a master's thesis on viola, so there you go. I mean, because she has appealed. No, but it's also the great men, the martyrs. Yeah. And a student interested in the civil rights movement is looking now at those people who are, by the way, being recovered because of local history organizations, being recovered because of commemorations. And so, you know, back to in our education, we can celebrate the birthdays, the achievements, the publications, and these can lead us back into documents, into contributions of those people who don't have a national holiday, but ask your students to nominate national holidays. Ask them to, you know, create this. And part of this is when my sons were in public education and I went into the local schools and into the local libraries, I found that a good 75% of the children's books on African Americans were on sports figures and entertainers. So, you know, as an educator, I saw that as a way, and we often, you know, at publishers listen to the teachers and the request, and you didn't get out and do that until someone called and said, we need this biography. I mean, it was in your heart, but it gets translated through the calls for finding these people in everyday life.
So let's open it up for question and answer. There should be a microphone coming. There's a question back there, behind you.
I'm over here.
That way, to the right. Yes.
Thank you.
I'm Fernbeck, and this has been great. One of the things, though, in Massachusetts for the 90th anniversary of the suffragette movement, of the right to vote, I was really struck. Hi, everybody. I was really struck with going back to that era and thinking about how whitewashed that is in history, whether it's British history or American history. And there was something done on cable that was called Iron-Jawed Angels by Hilary Swank. And it showed how completely violent it was, especially before the First World War, to get that vote. And we really have lost, well, it was never taught in school that way, certainly. And the fact that women really have only had the vote in America for 90 years, and the fact that we don't know all those unsung heroes and that happened over a 70-year period and in England is just a crime, because there was tremendous violence with people like Woodrow Wilson in terms of dealing with women's right to vote and carry their plaques and jail them. So I think that has to be looked at as well, that women realize on the backs of these women that took generations to give us the freedoms that we have, and how important it is to keep those memories alive, which are not. So that's my little...
Would you like to comment on that?
I would just like to say that one of the most formative experiences I had was with the League of Women Voters, which is one of the organizations sponsoring this particular event. And I spent many years at the local level discovering how useful an independent group from whatever the establishment was could be in terms of studying, moderating meetings, and just providing information to others. But unfortunately, like many other groups, it has shrunk in size and is no longer the kind, unfortunately, as I see it, the formative group for understanding how to conduct democratic procedures and meetings, which was what I learned basically in the League. And so, you're here, good, good. I know you're doing lots of good work. I had a league of 800 members that I was president of in my community. You can't get that big anymore that I know of. And this is one of the kinds of activities that women were so good at. They could handle their homes, their children's schedules, and then take part in these community activities, which really helped to form the glue for their local activities in their local communities. And maybe you've got something different now to contribute to that? We have
There's a hand up
someone there. But I think
I will say that women voted in New Jersey.
The what?
And women voted in New Jersey at the end of the 18th and early 19th century, and they lost the vote. So one of the things is to recover the fact that we have a lot of these privileges, and without organizing and maintaining education about the value of the vote and the value of women's organizations, things can slip away.
Yes. Unfortunately, at the national level, it used to be historically we were about providing information and registering people to vote. Now at the national level, we have spent a lot of energy going around the country in these fights where the vote is being repressed. So we are engaging in lawsuits. If you'll notice, there are a lot of issues in various states, the latest one being Wisconsin. We were very active in Florida, in Pennsylvania, in Texas. You know, there are lots of issues in states where the vote is being repressed. So we are active in those kinds of battles. So we are still a very active organization, and our state president is here with us. So if you're in Massachusetts, please join us. The fight still goes on. Thank you.
Yeah, like ho-hum, registering people to vote. And now, in the past election, the eyes of the world look at the United States over this question of registering to vote, who is entitled to vote. And the League of Women Voters, we hope, should have, a groundswell because we take these things for granted and we get things. So the League of Women Voters is seen as on the front lines, not a party, but a bipartisan effort. And that is something that is looked at abroad as well. So please keep up the good work.
Right.
So we have time for one more question. Is there one more question?
So what I'd love to hear is, you all mentioned that we need mentors in the schools, and a lot of the higher ed institutions have brought adjuncts in to be mentors as practicing professors. And I'm just raising the thought for anybody who's here from DESE, is maybe we ought to think about having a model like that in our high school, middle school, elementary schools, so that we expand who the leadership is teaching our kids. And I think it would be a pipe dream to assume we could do it on a voluntary basis. And maybe there are some federal grants or some kind of program we could institute to underwrite practicing clinical types to come in and run tutorials in these different classes to make them more applied, more real, and really teach kids how to relate to practicing adults in the community. So that's my thought. So what do you think? And is it feasible?
I think, whatever gets models, role models in the classrooms so that students can see other people who are interested in them, who will listen to them, who bring content information to them, who will listen to their questions and interact with them, and at the same time facilitate the unit or the theme that's being taught. You should do it. Yes, I stay on the road because I stay in high school classrooms, and so they feed me as much as I hope I feed them. But I think that that's really important because, let me just be honest, I know that when I walk into a high school classroom, not my college classrooms, but I know a high school classroom, one, they're surprised that I'm an African American woman whose last name is to they're just not quite, they can't quite process it. But then they forget about that as we start talking about whatever I'm there for. And so that's worth my time away from research and my students to get into those high school classrooms and do that little bit for students. And I know that there are other colleagues, some on this day as well, but around the country who are happy to do that too.
I think the idea is a great idea, by the way, bringing in people from around the community to talk about whatever they do and bring them into high school classes so that they can see a variety of different role models. You don't really need government funding for that. I mean, it's something that could be done in every community just by inviting the local Chamber of Commerce or others to send in people regularly. I mean, we're a nation of volunteers, and that's just one of the many kinds of volunteering that can be done.
All right, let's thank our distinguished panelists for their comments.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Kimberly, for doing a fantastic job moderating that panel. And I'd like to thank our brilliant and insightful panelists for this fascinating presentation that you've had. Thank you so much for being here today. And I'd like to let you all know that Valerie and Joan and Catherine and Jocelyn and Sandra will all be in the back ready to sign books, yes, at the end of this presentation. So we're very excited to have them with us. And I think you can always know that when you come to a Pioneer Institute event, you are going to leave more invigorated intellectually and having learned things that you couldn't have anticipated a few hours earlier. So thank you so much for joining us here today. And congratulations to all of our panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to hear you all. It was great. I have conferences galore. I can't remember whether it's May. It's May. It's May the...
Thank you all. Thank you.
May